Saint Augustine says, "What happens of thee he himself God works in thee. Never anything happens of thee which he himself does not work in thee. Never is anything done by thee unless he works it in thee." The universal feeling that we possess free will is no proof of its reality, and only on the basis of the axiom that nothing is too unscientific or extraordinary to be possible, which is sound enough, can it be accepted as a possibility. Even Locke could not, for the life of him, reconcile omniscience and free will, although he believed in both. Taking free will as a sensation, we must pronounce it to be just as illusory as any other sensation, except as a sensation. On the other hand, the determinist view cannot be classified as a sensation, but is rather a product of reason. Professor James says, "Genuine determinism affirms, not the impotence of free will, but the unthinkability of free will." St. Paul writes, with reference to sin, "It is no more I that do it, but sin, or evil karma, that dwelleth in me." And we are instructed in some parts of the Christian scripture that all good is of God, and not of ourselves. Here, then, there appears to be a complete obliteration of the idea of free will in respect of actions either good, bad, or indifferent. And in confirmation of this view it is necessary to remember that the language of free will was used for convenience sake, that God is distinctly said to have called those things which be not as though they were. St. Paul says, "The creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly." Possibly he may have had in mind when he delivered this dictum the vanity, or vain conceit, of assuming free will. If it be permissible to assert that we exercise no control, in the sense of free will, over the functions of our digestive organs, which perform the work without our being sensibly conscious of it, except in the case of abnormal disturbance, one would think the assertion might be extended in regard to cerebral functions also. We conceive thought to precede many of our actions, but if thought is the non-spatial accompaniment of cerebral cell action, and the latter is no more amenable to the control of free will than our digestive organs are, then those actions which are the sequences of thought cannot be free will actions. It is generally admitted that there are occasions when an individual acts without exercising free will. When, for instance, a man loses his head, as the expression goes, in a sudden catastrophe. There are also distinctly involuntary actions, such as blushing, turning pale, perspiring, etc. It seems, then, that an individual only exercises his will, according to general belief, under certain conditions. But if free will is acknowledged to be absent under some conditions, may we not reasonably conclude that it may be absent altogether, and only exists as an illusion of the senses? Anyhow, circumstances, or, in other words, the molecular activities of the universe, appear to be the dominant factor in determining our actions. These activities, when working through cerebral cells, turn out thoughts. When operating through the skin pores, they produce perspiration. Locke, in his chapter on power, human understanding, seems to draw very near to an admission of determinism, but then flies away from it, evidently alarmed by the specter of irresponsibility. He labors to demonstrate that uneasiness or desire determines the will to the successive, so-called voluntary actions whereof the greatest part of our lives is made up, and by which we are conducted through different causes to different ends. This is, as far as it goes, unadulterated determinism. Dr. Paul Carus defines freedom of will as the power to do that which one wills, not as the freedom of a man to will what he wills. Indeterminism he declares to be based upon error, because it attributes to man an exceptional place in the universe. Man is supposed to be exempt from the uniform and inexorable law of cause and effect which rules in the universe. He says, "The decision of a free man depends upon his character. But character is only the result of innumerable causes, which has become a cause upon which other effects follow, according to the cosmic law of causation, which must include in its impartial sway man as well as all other integrations of matter." Determinism is morally safe because man cannot escape from the feeling that he possesses free will, which, nevertheless, is an illusion, in the sense that illusions are ideas that have not originated from the data of experience. In Light, April 18, 1898, there is quoted the following, as part of a discourse on the evolution of mind. Delivered by Professor Jordan. The plant searches for food by a movement of the feeding parts alone. The tender tip is the plant's brain. If locomotion were in question, the plant would need to be differently constructed. It would demand the mechanism of the animal. The nerve, brain, and muscle of the plant are all represented by the tender growing cells of the moving tips. The plant is touched by moisture or sunlight. It thinks of them, and in so doing the cells that are touched and think are turned towards the source of the stimulus. The function of the brain, therefore, in some sense exists in the tree, but there is no need in the tree for a special sensorium. A comment in Light on this discourse runs as follows. In higher organisms the mind becomes more and more localized, until in the higher animals it has a special organ, the brain, which, however, is shut up in darkness and has no knowledge except such as comes to it from the sense organs through the ingoing sensory nerves. Being filled with these impressions, some of which are actual sensations, while others are memories of past sensations, the brain must make a choice among them by fixation of attention, if it is to act properly. To find data for such a choice is the function of the intellect. This drive, Jordan tells us, is the difference between mind and mere instinct, or inherited habits. Mind chooses, instinct cannot, for it is but an automatic mind process inherited from generation to generation. It must be remembered, however, that this faculty of choosing, said to be possessed by the brain and acquired by a process of development, is not free, but conditioned. The terminal organs of the afferent nerves also may be said to possess this faculty of choice, yet limited by the qualities and the nature of the external influences to which they are submitted. The admission of a faculty of choice does not involve the idea of absolute freedom, nor need it disturb the Buddhist conception that there exists nothing behind the organism in the shape of an ego entity, or soul, which chooses or remembers, and that there is no hidden agent which prompts the conveyance of impressions. If we admit this faculty of choice to be possessed by the brain and terminal organs of the afferent and efferent nerves, it simply involves the concession that the stored-up memories in the brain, and the habits acquired by the muscular organism, as results of past external influences, act in the manner of choice. And in this sense only, it would seem, can the notion of freedom be scientifically and logically entertained. If the faculty of choice, in this restricted sense, as the possession of a pluricellular organism such as man, is accepted in confirmation of the existence of freedom, then we must accord the possession of freedom to the simplest form of life. The cellule composed only of protoplasm and a nucleus possesses the very same faculty. M. Alfred Binet tells us of the highly developed psychical functions of the spermatozoid. How it searches out the locality of the ovule situated at a distance. How, with a sense of direction, it traverses the whole length of the intervening space, overcoming all obstacles, which are many, in its path, to attain the desired object. And he maintains that such actions cannot be explained by simple irritability, nor by chemical affinity. The brain may possess this faculty, and the power to carry into effect the choice, as qualities of its mechanism. But there is no discrete entity behind the brain as agent. Is it quite certain that, when consciousness seems to affirm that, I can choose so and so, it means more than, it is possible such and such a choice will take place in my mind? If it does not mean more than this, its affirmation is not against determinism. Mind, April, 1898, p. 191. Even if the faculty of choice is granted, it is limited in the sense that choice does not always produce the effect chosen. Locke and Hume say, liberty is a power to act as we choose. But can we choose? Are we the original causes of our choice? And what is the power to which action is subjected? Must it not be subject to some other power, and, therefore, not free, unless it is a self-existent power? Enough has been said, perhaps, on this subject to explain the author's position in assuming that both Jesus and Gautama must have been, by necessity of their omniscience, well aware of the truth of determinism. Yet, having to deal with phenomenal beings, they were constrained to treat them as such, and address them in phenomenal terms, and to lower themselves to the level of those sensations from which the elusive and unconquerable feeling of responsibility arises. The fact of occult powers having been attributed to Jesus and Gautama makes it necessary to include in this chapter a brief reference to the subject of magic, and to consider in what light we should regard this art in connection with these two characters. It has been remarked that the opposition to magic has seldom been connected with skeptical doubts as to its reality, and that the distinction drawn between white and black magic was due to the assumption by the priestly class of the sole right to the exercise of magic in the rites, and, hence magicians who were outside the pale of priesthood were called sorcerers, or dealers in black magic. The pages of the Christian Bible are aflame with magic, and, on opening the Old Testament, one seems to stand on the threshold of an unmeasurable cavern, where dreams the great magician that inhabiteth eternity. No one who has not made of magic, in its several branches, a close study, who has not literally soaked in mysticism, that powerful solvent of definite dogma, or who is not gnomic, intuitionally, in the know, without study, can possibly pose as an authoritative interpreter of God's holy word. An authority on the Hermetic philosophy says that astrology is to be found throughout the Bible, from the very first chapter of Genesis, when the stars were set for signs and seasons and days and years, on to the book of Revelation, where the wonder was seen in heaven, the woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and all the great astrological problems in that book. And the great truth, the incarnation itself, announced by the star of the Epiphany. All the occult methods of divination more or less find the place in the Bible and in the scheme of religion. The divination by Urim and Thummim is a well-known form of clairvoyance which is practiced now. Joseph's divining cup was merely a species of magic mirror, the form of which is well known now, and is used by some clairvoyant seers. The use of music by the prophet Elisha, when the kings of Israel and Judah went out against Moab, is precisely the same as is now used by many spiritualist mediums and seers, though not with the same effect ordinarily. And so one might go on with all the forms of divination. It can be clearly proved that divination by cards was known and practiced in biblical times by the biblical prophets. All this showing that during the times of the Old Testament, and with commendation from the prophets, and in use by the prophets, were modes of divination which postulated the truth of the Hermetic science. It stands to reason that Jesus as God, and Gautama as Buddha, must have been acquainted with all the laws of nature, and, consequently, were in full possession of so-called occult powers. The manifestations of these powers enter more largely and distinctly, as true records, into the life of Jesus than into that of Gautama. The acts of Jesus were one continuous demonstration of occult power, and his disciples were, in a lesser degree, gifted with the same powers. That which is known as ceremonial magic was not made use of to any extent by Jesus and Gautama as a method or means for the production of these powers. This was not requisite with them, as it is in the case of ordinary individuals, who must have recourse to those aids which have been found by occultists, after long experience, to be the most efficient means of attaining their object. Clumsier methods have been used with a minimum amount of success. But, if the operator desires to arrive at any degree of perfection in the art, it is just as necessary for him to observe closely the rules laid down by the ceremonialists of magic as it is for a gamekeeper to make use of the accepted symbolism in the training of a retriever, that is, if the object is to accomplish the undertaking with the least trouble and the best results. Jesus and Gautama, on account of the unique position as being en rapport with this power, had no occasion, therefore, to resort to ceremonial magic. The Indian Sant Mazumdar, whose acquaintance I had the privilege of making in India, in his introductory remarks to the Oriental Christ, a book published by him in 1883, points out how estimates of character vary if viewed from different standpoints, and how, when the singularity of a nature happens to lie in its many-sidedness, representations of it may be conflicting, but quite genuine and correct. The whole of the introduction to this work shows such remarkable and original insight into the character of Jesus, as judged from an Oriental point of view, that I cannot forbear to give a few quotations, more especially as they may tend to help forward the purpose of this chapter by demonstrating how the personalities of Jesus and Gautama are interchangeable under certain aspects in respect of the mystic significance. Early in the introduction the writer says, "It is held that the celestial figure of the sweet prophet of Nazareth is illumined with strange and unknown radiance when the light of Oriental faith and mystic devotion is allowed to fall upon it. It is a fact that the greatest religions of the world have sprung from Asia. It has, with some accuracy, been said, therefore, that it is an Asiatic only who can teach religion to Asiatics. In Christ we see not only the exaltedness of humanity, but also the grandeur of which Asiatic nature is susceptible." In the following very plain terms he distinguishes Christ as the logos of the Gospel of St. John, with which may be classified the body or intelligence of the Buddhists. He was the thought and energy of God. He was the plan of God. He was the light of divine reason and love, as yet involved within the great impenetrable. In that sense the whole universe was at one time merely the thought of the infinite being. And every one of us has sprung from the formless ocean of divinity that spread through all. John the Baptist, he writes, had announced the kingdom of heaven. Jesus pointed to it. Pointed where? He pointed to the kingdom of heaven in his own heart. He pointed to the inner sphere where his disembodied spirit communed with the eternal spirit of life. And, beholding God in him and himself in God, he exclaimed, "I and my Father are one." He also beheld his brethren in him, and cried, "Abide in me, and I in you." This, the writer says, is pure idealism, and Christ even idealized his flesh and blood, and administered them to his disciples as a sacrament. Finally, this enraptured saint of Hindustan places before the reader two characters in illustration of the distinctions which may be said to exist between Eastern and Western conceptions of Jesus. One of them is an elaborately learned man, versed in all the principles of theology. His doctrine is historical, exclusive, and arbitrary. He insists upon plenary inspiration, becomes stern over forms, continually descants on miracles. Condemns men to eternal darkness and death. He continually talks of blood and fire and hell. He hurls invectives at other men's faith. All scriptures are false which have grown up outside of his dispensation, climate, and authority. He is tolerated only because he carries with him the imperial prestige of a conquering race. Can this be the Christ that will save India? By his side another figure. He is simple, natural. He is a stranger to the learning of books. Out of the profound, untaught impulses of his soul he speaks. His doctrines are the simple utterances of a fatherhood which embosoms all the children of men, and a brotherhood which makes all the races of the world one great family. All nations respond to his mystical utterances about heaven and earth. His self-immersed air, absent eyes, which show that his spirit is far, far away, point him out to be the prophet of the East, the sweet Jesus of the Galilean lake. Throughout the whole Eastern world the perfume of his faith and devotion has spread. The wild genius of Muhammad knew and adored him amid the sands of Arabia. The tender, love-intoxicated soul of Hafiz reveled in the sweetness of Christ's piety amid the rosebuds and nightingales of Persia. Look at this picture and upon that. When we speak of an Eastern Christ we speak of the incarnation of unbounded love and grace. And when we speak of a Western Christ, we speak of the incarnation of theology, formalism, ethical, and physical force. Christ, we know, is neither of the East nor of the West. But men have localized what God meant to make universal. Happily, there is no need to substantiate the fact of the immense consolations derived by humanity from the Christian mode of regarding the past, the present, and the future, with all its dazzling possibilities, in the direction of a new Jerusalem. But it must, indeed, seem strange to those nurtured amid Christian influences that a religious system such as Buddhism, which does not recognize a God, a soul, or immortality in the Occidental sense of these terms, should claim to have as its product that Kerlega temperament which is said to be, and to have been, the distinctive characteristic of its countless adherents. When the mind wanders afar from the dogmatic of the scholiast, the life of Jesus presents itself with a dramatic force of loveliness and grandeur which, of its kind, cannot be surpassed. And the poetic pathos of the New Testament, though not so resonant as that to be found in the pages of such works as Job and the Prophets, possesses a pastoral charm of its own, at once soothing and stimulating. In Buddhistic literature, and in the intensity of Buddhistic thoughts, there are extraordinary and unrivaled beauties which are emphasized in a remarkable manner, in the sympathetic rendering accorded to them by such exponents as Professor Oldenburg and Mr. Lafcadio Hearn. One must be insensitive to a degree if such writers and interpreters of Buddhism do not succeed in striking a chord of overwhelming harmony throughout the system.